A boarding pass, slapped back onto a tray table like garbage, not returned, not handed back, dropped. The sound of it hit the cabin like a small explosion, nobody named out loud. Security in the aisle. A manager blocking her row. Cameras rolling. An entire system, 14 months, 17 victims, one buried memo, all of it aimed at a single tube sitting completely still in seat 2A. They were certain she didn't belong there. They had no idea she owned the plane they were standing on. She reached into her bag, and the reckoning began. Patricia Okafor just wanted to get home. She had a valid ticket, a confirmed seat. First class, Dallas to Charlotte, a flight she'd taken dozens of times for her work. She boarded early. She sat down. She put her bag in the overhead and her coffee on the tray table and opened the book she'd been trying to finish for 3 weeks. And then the first crew member came, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. Each one certain, each one wrong. Each one protected by a system that never once stopped to ask why this has kept happening to the same kind of passenger in that kind of seat. She spent 3 hours of that flight being treated like a crime scene. She filed a complaint. It was acknowledged with a form letter. It was closed with a voucher for $250 toward a future North Star flight. $250. That was 8 months ago. Today, the woman in seat 2A is different. Today, somebody came prepared. The contract was 43 pages long. Simone Carter had read every word herself, not because her lawyers hadn't, they had. 3 of them, billing $400 an hour each, who had flagged 14 clauses and negotiated 7 revisions, and sent her a summer-side document with color-coded tabs. She read it anyway, because she had a rule she'd kept since the day she signed her first lease agreement 22 years ago in a cramped Atlanta office with a broken air conditioner and a prayer. Read everything yourself, because nobody protects your name like you do. She uncapped her pen, turned to the signature page, and signed Dr. Simone Carter, CEO, Carter Aviation Group. The ink was barely dry when the man across the table started clapping. Slow, deliberate, the kind of applause that's really just a performance of itself. Jeffrey Albrighthort, North Star's vice president of partnerships, had the smile of someone who'd practiced it until it looked natural. Welcome back, Simone. He gestured at the signed document like a man gesturing at a painting he'd just acquired. Another 5 years, another chapter. 23 aircraft, Simone said, not smiling back. $340 million, and my name is Dr. Carter in this room. Referee's smile flickered, just for a second, then came back slightly adjusted. The recalibration of a man who understood he couldn't afford to lose her. Of course, he said. Dr. Carter. She capped her pen, stood without waiting for anyone to pull out her chair, because she'd stopped waiting for that particular performance 15 years ago. Picked up her bag. Walked to the elevator. The ride down from the 32nd floor took 47 seconds. She counted them. Not because she was a shanks, because stillness needed something to anchor it. And she'd learned a long time ago that counting was cleaner than feeling. Her phone buzzed. Denise. She answered on the 3rd ring. Car's outside, Denise said. Your 3 o'clock got pushed to 4, and your mother called. I'll call her from the plane. A pause. The kind Denise used when she was deciding whether to push. She pushed. About the plane, Denise. You just handed them $340 million and you want to fly commercial. No car service on the other end no first class. That is not the point, and you know it. Simone walked through the North Star lobby. Polished floors. Backlit logo. A placard near the elevator that read Valued Partnerships Builds the Future, which she had always found slightly ironic, given that she owned 14% of the aircraft in this building's promotional photographs. She stopped near the revolving doors. I need to know what it feels like, she said, to be a regular person on one of their planes. Before to hand them another 5 years, I want to see how they treat people when there's no one watching. Denise was quiet. That's what worries me, she said finally. The no one watching part. Simone's walked through the revolving doors into the Houston afternoon heat, which came at her like something that had been waiting. I'll be fine, she said. You always say that. I'm always right. She got into the car. As it pulled away, she looked back at the North Star Tower, at the glass and steel of it. It reflected the sky back at itself and called that transparency. She thought about the 17 reports, the ones Denise didn't know she'd already read. She had commissioned research 4 months ago. Not under her own name, under a subsidiary. because she needed the data clean and uncontaminated by anyone knowing who was asking or why. She'd read all 17 reports in a sitting on a Sunday evening in her home office with a cold cup of coffee and a growing feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't surprise. That was the thing that stayed with her longest after. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. The kind that comes when you've experienced something many times yourself, quietly, in spaces you couldn't afford to react. And then you see it documented in black and white, and you think, there it is. There's the shape of it. The thing that felt personal every time it happened but turns out to be structural. Report 4. Male passenger first class, asked to show boarding pass 3 times on the same flight. Other passengers, not asked once. Report 9. Female passenger removed from premium economy on suspicion of unauthorized upgrade. Seat assignment correct. Passenger offered apology. No further action taken against crew. Report 11. Patricia Okafor, Dallas to Charlotte. 4 separate crew members. 3 hours. A voucher. Report 14. Male passenger business class. Boarding pass held for 7 minutes while crew verified with ground staff. Reso issue found. No apology. Gindulti. Report 17. Female passenger first class. Flight attendant commented that the seat seemed above her pay grade. Set within earshot of other passengers. 17 reports. 14 months. 0 crew members disciplined. 3 apology letters. 4 vouchers and a memo. Internal. Dated 11 months ago. From SourceStar's own passenger experience division. Documenting the pattern. Recommending a pilot program for mandatory manifest verification before any crew challenge was escalated. Flagged as pending. Nothing done since. 11 of the 17 incidents happened after that memo was written. She'd read it and sat with it for a long time. Then she'd booked a seat on NS 2T241, Houston to Atlanta, in her own name, through the public website for $2,847. Because she needed to know one thing. Not whether North Star was capable of saying the right things in a conference room. She already knew they could do that. She needed to know whether the conditions on the ground had changed, whether the people on the plane today would behave differently from the people in those 17 reports. She would have her answer either way, and she would be ready for both. Gate 14B had the controlled chaos that all departure gates have. The particular shuffle of people who have been assigned groups, but have collectively decided the groups are suggestions. Simone joined zone without cutting, waited, handed her boarder pass to the gate agent who scanned it without looking up. She walked down the jet bridge. She stepped onto the plane and stopped for exactly 1 breath. The taser through the porthole window at the end of the jet bridge, small, partially obscured, but she saw it. N2241CA. She knew her own registration numbers, the way you know the handwriting of someone you love, automatically, before you even consciously read it. N2241CA. CA. Carter Aviation. This plane, this specific aircraft, belonged to her company, was leased to North Star under the contract she had signed 4 hours ago. In a room where Drevrik Albright had called her Simone until she corrected him, she filed that away, said nothing. Walked to seat 2A. She put her bag in the overhead, sat down, adjusted her blazer, opened her laptop, and pressed very quietly the small button on the left side of her watch. The recording began, not because she was certain something would happen, because she had learned over many years and many rooms and many moments of being underestimated in spaces she had earned the right to occupy. That certainty wasn't required, preparation was. His name was Jamie, 24 years old, 6 months into his first flight attendant posting. He was working the forward galley when the other one came down from the crew area. He'd flown with Brenda Holloway twice before. Both times he's filed something away in the part of his brain reserved for things you witness but haven't yet found words for. The way she moved through the first-class cabin with the authority of someone who had decided something before looking. The way her eyes scanned for problems, the way some eyes scan for problems that aren't really about problems at all. He watched her now, watched her scan the first-class cabin, watched her eyes find seat 2A. Stay there. He turned back to the galley, began arranging the pre-departure beverages, told himself it was none of his business. He would spend a long time after this flight not believing that. Brenda Holloway had been doing this job for 11 years. She was good at it, that mattered. She was genuinely technically good at the choreography of first-class service. The timing, the names. The way she could read a cabin's collective mood and adjust without anyone noticing the adjustment. She was good at her job. She was also, in ways she had never once sat down to examine, good at making certain passengers feel unwelcome in certain seats. And the thing about being good at something you've never examined is that you don't experience it as a choice. You experience it as instinct. You experience it as doing your job. She walked down the aisle to seat 2A with the smooth confidence of a woman on her own territory. The woman in the seat was looking at a laptop. Dark blazer, natural hair, close-cropped and neat. No visible jewelry except a watch that Brenda clocked and moved past because watches could be anything. The laptop was open to a document with a lot of text and a small logo in the corner she didn't look at closely enough. The woman looked
to browse Holloway's unexamined eyes like someone who was in the wrong place.
She'd had this feeling before. She'd acted on it before. Nothing had happened before. The woman looked up. Dark eyes, steady. "This is the first-class cabin," Brenda said. "Can I see your boarding pass?" A pause, just long enough. "Of course," the woman said. She reached into her blazer and produced the boarding pass, handed it over. Brenda took it, looked at it. Seat 2A, first class, North Star NS2241, Houston to Atlanta. Sir Simone Carter. Zilked pill to the back as though boarding pass kept secrets on their reverse side. She handed it back, not in the woman's waiting hand, onto the tray table, set down deliberately, like something she'd prefer not to touch longer than necessary. "I'll need to verify this with the system," Brenda said. "Of course," the woman said. Same voice, same steadiness. Brenda walked back up the aisle. Behind her, Simone picked up the boarding pass from the tray table, placed it in her breast pocket, returned her eyes to the laptop. Her right hand rested on the arm of the seat. The watch was running. At the galley, Jamie watched Brenda pull up the passenger manifest on the cabin tablet, watched her look at the screen, watched her look back toward seat 2A, watched something move in her face, something he still didn't have the vocabulary for, something in the category of a person finding a reason to do what they've already decided to do. He watched her pick up the cabin phone. He went back to his beverages. His hands were not entirely steady. He told himself that was the cold air from the cabin system. He was not entirely convinced. Derek Shaw had been the senior flight manager on the Houston hub for 9 years, 54 years old. The kind of man who wore authority the way some men do, not loudly but heavily like additional gravity. He'd developed over 9 years a set of intuitions about situations that he trusted the way you trust a compass you've carried long enough. Fast, automatic, rarely examines. He arrived on the first clapping 90 seconds after Brenda's call. She met him at the galley, spoke quietly. He listened. He didn't look at the tablet, didn't check the manifest. Looked at Brenda's face, which had the expression of certainty, and then looked at seat 2A and the woman sitting in it, and made a calculation that took about 4 seconds and was based on things he had never written down because he had never needed to. He walked down the aisle. "Ma'am." Simone looked up. Shaw had a way of standing over a seated person. Not threatening exactly, but very clear about who was vertical and who wasn't. "There seems to be some confusion about your seat assignment. If you could come with me, there's no confusion," Simone said. "I'm in seat 2A. My boarding pass confirms it. We've had some system issues today. I'd like to get this sorted before we complete boarding." "Boarding is already complete," she said. Shaw looked back at the cabin. She was right. He recalibrated. "If you could step to the rear." "I'm comfortable here, thank you." The words were polite. The tone was something the words didn't quite contain. Not hostile, not raised, just settled. Like someone who had put down roots in the last 30 seconds and was not interested in being uprooted. Shaw looked at her for a long moment. He made a decision he would spend the next several months examining from every angle. He went to call security. In seat 3B, just behind the first-class divider, she was not looking at her phone. She was looking at the woman in seat 2A. She was 31 years old, aviation insurance, flying to Atlanta for a conference she'd been looking forward to for months. She'd been close enough to the divider to hear the exchange, all of it. The boarding pass asked for, the pause before it was produced, the way it came back onto the tray table instead of into the woman's hand. She'd heard all of it. She was sitting with what hearing it felt like. Because she knew what it was, she recognized its shape, had seen its shape before and not said anything and driven home afterward, and sat with that silence for 14 months and counting. Chicago to Denver. A man in business class 2 rows ahead. A crew member approaching with that same quality of certainty that didn't come from checking anything. Sophia had watched, had thought about saying something, had assembled the reasons not to, and arranged them neatly, and called them practical, and looked back at her phone. She'd thought about him a lot since. She looked at the woman in seat 2A, who was looking at her laptop with the focused attention of someone who had decided not to let the room's behavior change her own. Sophia thought, you could say something now, right now. She looked at her hands. She didn't say it yet, but she didn't look away either. Paul Mercer, seat 1C, had a different relationship with his phone. 57, the expensive suit, the expensive shoes. Stitch the watch cost more than most punks in 2 months and did not, unlike the one on the woman in 2A, have a secret courting function, but was still more watched than most people in this cabin would ever own. He'd been watching the situation since Brenda's first approach. He'd made the assessment quickly, the way he made most assessments. Fast, intuitive, based on a set of defaults so deeply embedded, he'd stopped noticing they were defaults. He'd looked at the woman in 2A. He'd looked at the crew's certainty. He'd arrived at a conclusion before anyone had produced any evidence for it, and then he'd picked up his phone, not to help, to record. He had 47,000 followers on a platform where this kind of footage, framed correct, performed well. He knew exactly what caption he'd write, knew which hashtags, knew the way the comments would go and how to let them go that way without technically participating. He positioned the phone against the window, started the video. Didn't notice this, yet the small logo in the corner of the laptop screen 6 feet ahead of him. Didn't notice what those 2 letters meant. He would, but not yet. Officer Ray Tatum had been working airport security at Houston Intercontinental for 11 years. 43 years old, 6 feet, built with the kind of quiet mass that communicated competence without effort. He was methodical. He was fair. He had a reputation among his colleagues for handling difficult situations with the minimum necessary force and the maximum necessary clarity. He was also a man who had spent 11 years performing a specific kind of invisible mathematics, the math of being black in a uniform, of being the authority and the suspected simultaneously, sometimes within a single sentence, of knowing with precision that had been paid for across many years and many rooms. Exactly what a scene looked like from the outside, and what it felt like when you were inside it, and the person at the center of it looked like your mother, or your sister, or yourself 10 years ago before the badge. He boarded the aircraft when the call came through, walked down the jet bridge, stepped into the first-class cabin, and saw her, dark blazer, close-cropped hair, laptop open, completely settled in seat 2A with a particular quality of stillness that belonged to someone who had decided exactly how much of the room's anxiety she was going to absorb, which was none. Something moved in Ray Tatum in the first 3 seconds. Not recognition, not yet. Something adjacent. The way you almost hear a song before you actually hear it. Shaw was right behind him, close enough that Ray could feel the weight of his expectation pressing forward, directing the scene before it had been assessed. Ray walked down the aisle, stopped at row 2, looked at the woman, and then he placed her. Not because she was famous, not because she was on any list he'd ever read, but because his younger sister Cynthia had worked in the finance department of Carter Aviation Group for 5 years. Because Cynthia talked about her job the way people talk about the rare thing. Work they're actually proud of. Work that feels like it means something. Because Cynthia had, across many Sunday dinners and many phone calls, mentioned the name of the woman who had founded the company, who had walked into banks with a business plan and walked out with rejection letters until she found the one person who would listen, who had built something from one maintenance contract in Atlanta into a fleet management operation that now touched 11 major airlines across the continent. He knew this face. He knew who was sitting in seat 2A, and the knowing did not make anything easier. It made everything harder. Because if he said he knew who she was, he'd have to explain why he hadn't said so in the first 3 seconds. He'd have to disclose Cynthia, the family connection, the appearance of personal involvement. He'd hand Shaw something to use, conflict of interest, compromised neutrality, the language that got security officers pulled from situations and reviewed and quietly moved to less visible assignments. He'd seen that happen. The math ran in about 4 seconds. 4 seconds, and then he made the choice. Not the right one, the available one. Because sometimes those are the same thing, and the system you work inside determines which options are actually on the table. "Ma'am," he said. His voice came out quieter than the moment required. Not much. Just enough that if she was the kind of person who listened carefully, she'd hear the difference between professional and complicit. She was exactly that kind of person. "I've been asked to verify your seat assignment," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were direct, not accusatory, not frightened, just fully present. The way the eyes of someone look when they are collecting information and have enough experience to know what they're looking at. "My boarding pass is in my breast pocket," she said. "I showed it to the flight attendant. I'm in the correct seat. I understand that. If you could just step to, officer." A pause. Clean pick with the captain. Ray looked at her. Behind him, Shaw made a sound. "That's not how this works," Shaw said. "We can resolve this right here." "I disagree," the woman said, and her eyes moved from Ray to Shaw and back with the precision of a woman who had already mapped the room and identified where the actual power in it lived. "I'd like to speak with the captain." Ray held her gaze. One more second. He thought about Cynthia. He thought about 5 years of Sunday dinners. He thought about the 11 years of math and what it cost to keep doing it. And then he said, to Shaw, in the flattest professional register he owned, "The passenger is requesting to speak with the flight crew," which was not agreement, but was not removal either. It was the smallest possible thing, the thing that costs the least while still being something, and it cost more than it looked like. And she heard the difference. He knew she heard it. Because her eyes, when they came back to him for just a moment before she returned her attention to her screen, held something that was not gratitude and not anger. Something more like, "I see exactly what just happened here," which was worse in some ways than either of the others. Paul Mercer was still recording when he saw it. Not the big thing, not the thing that would change everything. Just a moment when the woman in 2A shifted the angle of her laptop screen, and in the adjustment, for a fraction of a second, the logo in the corner became visible. He had to zoom, but then he saw it clearly. 2 letters, CA, and beneath them, small but legible, Carter Aviation Group. He lowered the phone, sat very still, because Paul Mercer was, among several other things, the chief risk officer for a mid-size aviation insurance firm that had been in active litigation with Carter Aviation Group for 7 months over a fleet insurance contract worth, at last count, somewhere in the neighborhood of $62 million. He was, in fact, flying to Atlanta for a meeting that was, in part, about that contract. He looked at the woman in seat 2A, looked at his phone, looked back at the woman. Something shifted in the geometry of the last 8 minutes, the way a room changes when you realize the thing you thought was furniture is actually structural. Remove it and everything falls. He didn't say anything. Not yet. But he looked at the 47 seconds of footage on his phone screen and thought about the caption "Higin Bozen Kafalani" and thought about the 47,000 followers and thought about the $62 million and then thought about something else entirely. He thought about what kind of person he was in this story. He'd spent 47 seconds being one kind. The question was whether he had enough time left to be an undercover. Captain Linda Park came out of the cockpit because something didn't add up. 51 years old, 24 years of flying, 11 in command. She had a specific relationship with things that didn't add up. The kind of relationship developed over decades of reading instrument panels and weather systems and crew dynamics and learning to trust the moment when the total didn't equal the sum of its parts. The delay report didn't add up. She'd heard enough through the cockpit door to know that a passenger was being asked to move. She'd heard the security call. She'd heard Shaw's voice with its particular texture of institutional authority. She came out anyway. Took in the first-class cabin in about 3 seconds, the officer standing mid-aisle, Shaw behind him. The woman in seat 2A with her laptop and her boarding pass in her breast pocket, and the absolute stillness of someone who has decided to outlast the room. Linda looked at the woman, and then she looked at the jet bridge porthole and read the tail number, into 1CA. She had flown this aircraft before Foos. Twice she kept tail numbers the way surgeons keep the serial numbers of instruments they've used automatically, precisely because details were the difference between a flight and an incident. N2241CA. CA, she turned, walked to seat 2A. Shaw moved to intercept. She looked at him the way she looked at weather that was going to have to wait. He stopped. She crouched slightly, eye level. Direct, the posture of someone who understood that towers over a seated person is a choice, not a necessity. "I'm Captain Park," he said. "I apologize for the disruption. Are you connected to Carter Aviation?" Something shifted in the woman's face. Not surprise. Not relief exactly. More like, finally someone asked the right question. "Yes," she said. "Are you Dr. Carter?" One full breath. "I am," she said. Captain Linda Park, 24 years of flying, 11 years in command, stood up slowly. Looked at Derek Shaw with an expression he would describe later to his wife as the moment he understood the difference between authority and the appearance of authority. Looked at the tail number one more time. Looked at Ray Tatum and said with the quiet certainty of someone who had been asking the right questions long enough to know what they cost, "I need everyone to stop. Right now, everything stops." The cabin didn't precise exactly. What it did was reorganize. Like a room where someone has just turned on the real lights after everyone's been navigating by the wrong ones. Same furniture, different shadows, different understanding of where things actually were. Paul Mercer lowered his phone to his lap. Sophia Reyes sat up straighter in 3B. Stopped pretending her eyes were somewhere else. Jamie, at the galley, set down the glass he'd been holding for 2 minutes without doing anything with it. Shaw stood in the aisle with its simped where the Brookhaven Bidibra directed. His excess was only now beginning to understand where it went. And Brenda Holloway stood near the curtain at the galley entrance, and the certainty in her face, the certainty that had been there, since she'd first looked at seat 2A and decided something before can check anything, had a crack running through it. Not broken, not yet, but cracked. And Ray Tatum stood at the back of the first-class section and felt the thing he'd been holding in his chest since the moment he recognized the woman in 2A begin to shift, not release. Shifting is different from releasing. Releasing means it's over. Shifting means it's moved into a different part of you, a part you'll carry from now on. He thought about Cynthia. He thought, she is going to have so much to say about this. He thought that involuntarily, the way your brain reaches for something human in the middle of something hard. The way dark humor is really just love wearing a disguise. He almost smiled. Almost. Simone Carter sat in seat 2A and watched the cabin reorganize itself. She'd been watching since she boarded. That was the thing about holding still. People forgot you were doing it on purpose. They thought stillness was vacancy. They thought quiet was absence. They were wrong about that every time. She'd watched Jamie at the galley, who had never quite managed to pretend he wasn't paying attention, whose face was doing something honest and complicated that she respected even without knowing his name. She'd watched Sophia in 3B shift from pretending to watching, had noticed the moment she stopped looking at her phone and started looking at the scene, had noted the quality of it, not voyeurism, witness, different thing. She'd watched Paul Mercer in 1C lower his phone with the particular body language of a man mid-reassessment, had seen the moment he zoomed in on her screen, had watched the zoom change something in him. She'd watched Shaw, who had committed to a direction and was now standing in the consequences of it. She'd watched Brenda and the crack, and she'd watched Ray Tatum. She'd heard his voice when he spoke to her, the fraction of a degree below what the moment required. Not quite complicit, not quite clear. The voice of a man trapped between his knowledge and his position, making the smallest possible move that still qualified as a move, she thought. He knows something, she thought. That's going to matter. Outside the window, the Houston afternoon shimmered off the tarmac in waves. The tail number was still there. N2241CA, still hers. Still a plane she'd maintained and inspected and leased and sent aloft, carrying thousand who deserved to arrive without being handed their boarding passes back off tray tables. She thought about Patricia Okafor, $250. She thought about the memo dated 11 months ago, sitting in a pending file, doing nothing, while 11 more incidents accumulated on top of it. She thought about what she'd come here to find, not justice. Justice was too large a word for what one woman could accomplish in one cabin on one afternoon. What she'd come to find to sit was simpler and harder. She'd come to find out if North Star was the kind of organization that could look at what it was doing and choose to do something different. She didn't have her answer yet, but she had her watch running. She had the folder in her bag that Denise didn't know about. The folder with 17 reports and one internal memo, and the specific contractual language from Section 47 of the lease agreement that she'd put there herself 6 years ago, because she'd known, even then, that a day like this one was possible. She had the recording. She had patience. The kind of patience that doesn't look like waiting. The kind that looks like a woman sitting very still in, say, seat 2A, watching a cabin reorganize itself around the fact of her presence. While a captain she'd just met asked the question that should have been asked 40 minutes ago, and the question moved through the cabin like the first cold air of a weather change. Real and arriving, impossible to ignore. The kind of question, once as asked, you can't pretend was never necessary. Captain Linda Park stood in the first-class cabin of aircraft N2241CA and looked at the tail number through the window and looked at the woman in seat 2A and looked at Derek Shaw with his complicated expression and looked at Ray Tatum with his careful stillness. And she said to all of them, to the whole assembled tableau of the last 40 minutes, "Let's start over, from the beginning, correctly this time." It was the simplest thing anyone had said since Simone boarded. It was also the most important, because it named, without naming it, exactly what the last 40 minutes had been, a beginning done wrong that still had time to be done right. Simone looked out the window at the tail number 1 last time, N224C1C, her company, her plane, her name, encoded in 2 letters on the body of an aircraft, 40,000 pounds of aluminum and engineering, and careful maintenance, flying routes she'd built and fueled and made possible. And in this cabin, in this moment, still having to show a boarding pass that had already been shown. Still having it placed back on the tray table instead of returned to her hand. Still having to be twice as ready for half the respect. That was the weight of it, not the anger. The weight. The specific, bone-deep weight of a woman who had built something magnificent and still arrived in rooms where the room needed convincing. She felt it fully for one moment, let herself feel it. Then she put it somewhere she could reach it later, when she would need it for the part that came next. The part where she decided what to do with everything she had. Captain Linda Park had a rule. When you don't know what you're looking at, stop, look again. She was looking again now. The woman in seat 2A hadn't moved. Hadn't raised her voice, hadn't done any of the things people do when they're trying to win a public argument. No gesturing, no appeal to the cabin for witnesses, no performance of injury, just present. The way certain people are present when they've decided that room-anxiety is not their responsibility to absorb. Linda turned to Derek Shaw. She kept her voice at the register she used for difficult weather briefings. Professional, even. No room for interpretation. Mr. Shaw, has anyone verified this passenger's boarding pass through the manifest? Shaw opened his mouth, closed it. Brenda indicated. Through the system, Linda said. Not through an indication, through the actual passenger manifest. A pause, slightly longer than the first. I was in the process of, pull it up now. It had the structure of a request and the weight of something that wasn't. Shaw pulled out the cabin tablet, navigated, found the seats assignment. 2A, Carter, Simone. He looked at the screen for a moment longer than necessary. The way people look at things they were hoping would say something different. Well, Linda said. The seat is assigned, he said. Something in his voice had changed. Not much. The Swaya lock sounds different after it's given. To Dr. Carter, yes, who is currently sitting in the seat. Yes. Linda looked at him for one more second. Then she turned to seat 2A, Dr. Carter. Her voice was measured. Your seat assignment is confirmed. There was no irregularity. I apologize for what just happened in this cabin. Simone looked at her. I know, 2 words. No edge, no triumph. Just a statement of fact from someone who had known the whole time. Someone was simply acknowledging that the room had caught up. Something moved in Linda's chest, the feeling of a near miss, the specific discomfort of understanding how close something came to going very badly, and only didn't because one person finally asked the obvious question. 30 seconds. That was how long it had taken her. 30 seconds and one question. And nobody had asked it before she did. She looked at Shaw, who was looking at his tablet. She looked at Brenda, visible at the curtain edge, who was looking at the floor. She looked at Jamie at the galley, who was looking at nothing with the focused attention of someone memorizing everything. She said, to the cabin, to no one and everyone, we'll be resuming our departure sequence. I apologize for the delay. She started back toward the cockpit, stopped, turned once more. Dr. Carter, would you be willing to remain available after I speak with ground operations? There's something I need to discuss with you. Simone looked at her. Something small and private moved in her face. Of course, she said. The crack in Brenda Holloway spread the moment Linda walked away. That was the thing about cracks. You couldn't hold them at their first moment. They had their own logic, their own direction. She stood at the galley entrance and watched Derek Shaw walk back toward her with the expression of a man who had just discovered the ground he was standing on was different from what he'd thought. He stopped beside her, spoke quietly. "Why didn't you verify through the manifest before you called me?" Brenda looked at him. "I checked. You called me before checking the system." "I checked." She stopped. Something in the stop was different from her earlier stops. Earlier, she'd been recalibrating strategy. This one was different. This one was something running out of room. "The manifest showed her in 2A, Shaw said. Confirmed. No irregularity." Brenda was quiet. "What was the basis for the challenge?" he said. The question sat there between them. Brenda opened her mouth, closed it, because the honest answer to that question was not something he could say in this galley to this man in this moment. Maybe not something she'd ever said out loud to anyone, including herself, especially herself. Brenda started. "What?" Shaw said. "She seemed what?" Brenda looked at the floor. Shaw looked at her for a long moment, and in his face was the particular expression of a man who was starting to understand something he would have preferred not to understand. Not about Brenda, about himself. About the 4 seconds he'd spent looking at seat 2A before deciding. About the call he'd made without checking. About the confidence he'd brought into this cabin that had nothing to do with evidence. He'd built a wall around Brenda's certainty and called it management. He understood now what he actually built it around. "Stay in the galley," he said. His voice was flat, not angry, worse than angry, tired. "Don't approach the first-class section." He walked away. Brenda put one hand on the galley counter, stood very still, and thought about nothing, because sometimes thinking about nothing is what you do when thinking about the thing is too much to start yet. Paul Mercer had stopped recording. He was looking at the CA logo on the laptop screen, 6 feet ahead of him and running numbers. He knew Carter Aviation. Everyone in his industry knew Carter Aviation. Simone had built him a single maintenance contract in Atlanta into a fleet management and licensing operation with agreements across 11 major North American airlines. He'd been in 2 preliminary meetings about the fleet insurance contract in the last 7 months. He'd seen the company name on dozens of documents. He'd never put a face to it. He was putting a face to it now, and the face was the woman in seat 2A. The woman his video had been framing as a problem, as an irregularity, as someone who didn't belong in the space she was occupying. He looked at his phone, 47 seconds of footage. He looked at the cabin, at Shaw retreating, at Brenda's hand on the counter, at Jamie carefully rearranging things that didn't need rearranging, at the woman in 3B, Sophia, who had stopped pretending to look at her phone and was watching seat 2A with the expression of someone who had decided to be a witness. He looked back at the woman in 2A. He thought about the caption he'd been composing. He thought about 47,000 followers. He thought about $62 million. And then he thought about something that had nothing to do with either of those things. He thought about the 47 seconds of footage on his phone, which was accurate. That was the thing he kept arriving at and moving past and arriving at again. The footage was accurate. It showed exactly what had happened. And what had happened was wrong. Not complicated, not ambiguous. Wrong. And it was documented on his phone by a man who had started recording because he thought it would make good content, and was now holding evidence of something that deserved to be evidence. The reason he started was bad. The footage itself was not. He sat with that for a minute. Just sat with it. Then he opened the video, and instead of the caption, instead of the hashtags, instead of the comment strategy, he pressed share, not to his feed, to the head of his company's diversity and compliance team. With 3 words, "Watch this, all." He put the phone face down on the tray table. His hands were not entirely steady, but they were doing something different from what they'd been doing 8 minutes ago. That was enough for right now. That had to be enough. Sophia Reyes had stopped pretending entirely. She was watching seat 2A openly now. Not staring, watching. The way you watch something that you understand you're going to need to remember accurately. Because something had happened in the last several minutes that she needed to hold clearly. The captain had come out, had asked one question. Sis, 30 sequor that should have been asked before any of this started. Has anyone verified this through the system? That was it. That was the entire lever. And nobody had pulled it. Not Brenda, not Shaw, not Officer Tatum, not the dozen passengers who had watched this woman be challenged and questioned and stood over in front of a full cabin. Nobody. Until a woman with 24 years of experience and the authority to demand an answer walked out of a cockpit and asked it. Sophia looked at her own hands. She thought about Chicago to Denver, the man in business class, the slow erosion of small moments that nobody names as an incident even while it's happening. The way she'd assembled her reasons for not speaking and called them practical. She looked up and she did something she hadn't done last time. Excuse me. Her voice came out louder than she'd planned. That happened sometimes when you'd been holding something back long enough. It came out with the volume of everything behind it. Shaw, who had been re-entering from the galley, turned. I was right behind her on the jet bridge, Sophia said. I saw her boarding pass before she sat down. Seat 2A, first class, clear as anything. Shaw looked at her with the expression of a man who had run out of the kind of authority that worked in this situation. I appreciate that, ma'am. I'm not telling you for your appreciation, Sophia said. And that surprised her, too. The directness of it. Like something that had been waiting to be said in a cleaner form for 14 months. I'm telling you because it happened and someone should have said it 20 minutes ago and I didn't, and I'm saying it now. The cabin was very quiet. Simone turned her head, just slightly, found Sophia's eyes. Something passed between them. Not gratitude, exactly. Not sisterhood in the way movies imagine it. Something quieter and more specific. I see you choosing this. Sophia turned back forward. Her heart was moving faster than she'd expected, but her hands, when she looked at them, were steady. Captain Linda Park spent 18 minutes on 2 calls and 1 careful conversation with her first officer about what they were required to do and what they had the latitude to do beyond that. Then she walked back into the first-class cabin. She crouched beside seat 2A, eye level, the same posture as before. Dr. Carter, I've spoken with ground operations. We're cleared for departure in approximately 10 minutes. She paused. I'd like to ask you something directly, and I want to be clear you have no obligation to answer. Simone looked at her. Are you here in an official capacity? Simone held her gaze. Then she reached into her blazer and placed a business card on the tray table. Linda looked at it. Carter Aviation Group, Dr. Simone Carter, Chief Executive Officer and Founder. In the bottom left corner, small and clean. Primary contractor, Kershaw Fleet Division. Linda looked at the card, at the tail number through the window, at the woman in seat 2A. She assembled these 3 things in the order they deserve. Then she said quietly, How long have you been recording? Simone's expression moved towards something that might, in different circumstances, have been called warmth. Since Brenda put my boarding pass on the tray table, she said. Linda closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, opened them. I need to make a call, she said. She made it from the cockpit with the door closed. Director Carl Whitmore, North Star Airlines, VP of Operations, South Hub. The man whose desk the 17 incident reports had theoretically crossed on their way to becoming 3 apology letters and 4 vouchers. He picked up on the second ring. Linda, what's the delay? Sir, I have a situation in the first-class cabin requiring your immediate attention. Dr. Simone Carter of Carter Aviation Group is on NS 2241. She's been in seat 2A since boarding. She was challenged by a crew member and security was called, without her boarding pass being verified through the manifest. The silence that followed had a shape. Linda had heard silences like this before. They happened right before someone admitted something they should have reported earlier. Simone Carter, Whitmore said. Not a question. Yes, sir. Another silence, different texture, like something being compressed. How is she? Hey. Linda registered this, filed it. The question he'd asked, the question he hadn't asked yet. She's calm, Linda said. She's been calm throughout. She's been recording since the initial confrontation. The third silence was the longest. How much of this has already, sir? Linda's voice was precise, the voice she used when Weather was deciding something faster than a crew was. I think Dr. Carter should speak with you directly. A pause, he said. Put her on. Simone's had expected the call, not the specific shape of it, but its existence. When you have read 17 reports and hired a research firm under a subsidiary name and flown commercially on your own aircraft, specifically to witness what happens, you plan for most of the forms a situation can take. She took the handset Linda offered, held it for a moment, said, "Director Whitmore," not a greeting, a statement. "Dr. Carter." His voice had the warmth of someone who had spent decades in corporate environments and knew exactly how to produce it. "I'm deeply sorry for Carl." She used his first name, put it there like a fact. "I know your voice," she said. "We sat across from each other 14 months ago in Dallas. You called me Simone until I corrected you, and then you called me Dr. Carter and meant it more carefully for the rest of the meeting." Silence. "You know who I am," she said. "Not because I'm famous, because we have been in the same rooms. And your crew did not know who I was because you didn't communicate it to them. Not because you intended harm. Because it didn't occur to you that it mattered." She let that land. 2 full seconds, he didn't fill them. "That said," she said, "is the actual problem. Not Brenda Holloway alone. Not Derek Shaw alone. The problem is that the context which might have protected me never traveled from your office to this cabin. Because there is no mechanism in your operation for that travel. Because the people on this plane are not expected to know the names of the women who own what they're flying." "I hear you," Whitmore said. "Quieter now," something less managed under the words. "Before I continue," Simone says, "I want to note the first question you asked Captain Park." He waited. "It wasn't whether I was all right," she said. "It was how much of this was already online." Silence that followed was different from the others. Not calculation, something that felt even through a phone line like recognition. The uncomfortable specific recognition of someone seeing their own reflex clearly. "No," he said. "It wasn't." "No," she agreed, and let that be enough for now. She placed the folder on the tray table 20 minutes into the delay. Cream-colored, not thick, every page chosen deliberately. "This is a research report," she said to Linda, who was standing near the seat. "Compiled by an independent firm over 14 months. 17 incidents in North Star flights involving passengers who received differential treatment in boarding or seating processes." She set it down. "The incidents share a pattern. The pattern is documented. 0 crew members were disciplined. 3 incidents resulted in apology letters. 4 in vouchers." She looked at Linda directly. "I commissioned this report 4 months ago. I booked this flight 3 weeks ago. I came on this specific aircraft because I needed to understand whether North Star was capable of change. Not whether they could say the right things in a conference room. Whether the conditions on the ground had actually shifted." She looked at the folder. "I have my answer." Linda was very still. "What is it?" she said. "I don't know yet," Simone said, which surprised Linda. "You said you have your answer." "I have the first part," Simone said. "The conditions haven't changed. That's the first part." She looked at the cabin. "The second part is North Star does, now that someone is in a position to require accountability. That part I don't have yet." Linda looked at the folder, then at the tail number. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need you to keep being the person who asks the question nobody else thought to ask," Simone said. "The rest of it I'll handle." Shaw was in the aisle when Simone stood up from seat 2A. She didn't go to the cockpit. She walked toward him. He held his ground. Reflex. She stopped some 2 feet away. "Mr. Shaw." Same register she'd used since boarding. Measured. Even. "I want to ask you something. I'd like an honest answer." He looked at her. "When you decided to involve security, what was the basis for that decision?" He was quiet. "Brenda's report," he said. "Based on what did Brenda make her report?" Longer quiet. "She indicated a boarding irregularity, but the manifest showed no irregularity." She hadn't yet. She hadn't checked," Simone said. "Accurate, not accusatory. She formed an assessment before checking. You acted on that assessment before checking." Officer Tatum was positioned to act on that assessment before checking. A slight tilt of her head. "At what point in your process does someone ask what the assessment is actually based on?" Shaw said nothing, because there was nothing available to say. The answer was the question wasn't in the process. The process assumed strengths is certainty had a foundation. The process had no mechanism for verifying that it did, and 17 people across 14 months had experienced the output of that gap. "I'm not asking to humiliate you," Simone said. "I'm asking because in a few minutes we're going to have a conversation with your director about what changes. And I need to know if you understand what needs to change." Shaw looked at her. Something happened in his face that wasn't pleasant to witness. The thing that happens when a person sees themselves clearly, and the view is not what they would have chosen. "I understand," he said. She nodded once, walked back to her seat. The second document came out during the third Whitmore call. This one was white, crisp, the language of people who billed $400 as an hour and had been instructed to be precise. Simone placed it on the tray table beside the research folder. Linda, who had come back into the cabin to manage the departure sequence, saw it and stopped. "Our lease agreement," Simone said. Section. Subsection C. She turned it so Linda could read. "Any lessee found to engage in documented patterns of discriminatory passenger treatment, as depicted in Appendix D, may be subject to immediate tract review, remediation requirements, or termination of lease agreement at the discretion of Carter Aviation Group, with 90 days written notice." Linda read it twice. "You put this language in," she said. "We put it in every contract," Simone said. "Have for 6... Most airline sections sign it without reading Section 47 carefully. Because it's Section 47. Because the things that matter most are often in the sections nobody reads until they need them." Linda looked at the tail number. "North Star signed this 14 months ago," Linda said. "In the renewal meeting," Simone said, "that Carl Whitmore attended. So you've had grounds for contract review the entire time." "Yes. Then why come here instead of just..." "Because terminating the contract helps Carter Aviation's position and hurts North Star's operations, and helps no more who flies North Star next month." Simone folded her hands on the table, the gesture of someone explaining something they have thought through completely. "The contract is leverage. It's not the goal." "What's the goal?" Simone looked at the folder. "The next 17 reports not happening," she said. Whitmore's second call was different from the first. He'd been on other calls in the interval. His voice had a different architecture, more structured. The voice of a man who had been briefed and whilst performing having him be briefed. "Dr. Carter, I want to begin by I'll go first," Simone said, a pause. "Of course, 3 requests. Not demands, requests. With the understanding that my response to those requests will determine what happens to the contracts currently between our companies." She opened her notes. "First, a formal independent review of all 17 incidents in this report, not by North Star HR, third party. Findings shared directly with Carter Aviation Group.
Silence. Processing. Second.
A mandatory verification protocol. Any crew challenge to a passenger's seat assignment requires manifest verification before further action. No exception. Full crew retraining within 30 days. She paused. Third, Brenda Holloway is not terminated today. That one surprised him. She could feel it through the signal. She undergoes a structured remediation process, Simone said. Documented, overseen, with specific behavioral benchmarks. If she completes it, she retains her position. If she doesn't, termination is then appropriate. She looked toward the curtain where she knew Brenda was standing. Firing her today tells North Star Global was one person. The problem is not one person. The problem is 11 years of this behavior meeting no consequence. Termination right now rules as the symptom. Remediation addresses the condition. Whitmore was quiet for several seconds. The first 2, yes, he said finally, without qualification. The verification protocol within 30 days, I'll commit to that now. An independent review begins next week, another breath. The third one requires me to navigate HR carefully to make the remediation binding. I need 48 hours. You have them, Simone said. She looked at the window, at the tarmac, at the heat still rising off it. There's a fourth thing, she said. He waited. Not a request, a question. She looked at the folder. The 17 people in this report. What are you going to do for them? The silence that followed had a completely different quality from all the others. Not strategic, not processing. Something more like a person encountering a question they had not anticipated and understanding immediately why they hadn't. I don't know yet, he said, which was somehow the most honest thing he'd said in the entire conversation. Good, Simone said. Wrong answers sound like you already know. Figure it out. Tell me in 48 hours. She ended the call, placed the handset down, sat with a quiet for a moment. Ray Tatum had not moved from the rear of the first-class section. He'd been standing there long enough that his feet had registered it, long enough that he'd watched the entirety of what had unfolded from this fixed point, which meant he'd seen it with the particular clarity of someone slightly outside the action. He'd watched Simone with the folder, with the contract clause, with Shaw, with the calls. He'd watched her hold still while the room reorganized itself around the fact of her presence. Again and again, each time at a higher level of understanding, he thought about Cynthia. He'd have to tell her. There was no version of this where he didn't tell her. Cynthia, who talked about her job with a pride that had always made him feel something complicated, something adjacent to wishing he had that same clean relationship with the work he did. He thought about his choice. He'd chosen the available option over the right one, and he dressed it in professional language and called it process, and its since had still been what it was under Sunditha dressing. He looked at Simone Carter, sitting in seat 2A, the woman whose company his sister worked for, whose name he'd heard at Sunday dinners, who had built something from nothing and was seated on a plane she owned, being asked to prove she deserved to be there. He thought, that is what I contributed to today. Not because he was a bad person, because he was a person inside a system that made the wrong choice the cheaper one, and he'd paid the lower price, and she'd paid the difference. He needed to say something, not in the middle of the cabin, not while Shaw was still within earshot, not in a way that looked like performance, but before she got off this plane, something true. He could do that much. Paul Mercer had not gone back to work on his presentation. He'd been staring at the seat back in front of him for 20 minutes with the specific quality of a man conducting an internal audit. He sat on the board of 3 companies. He moved through rooms where decisions got made and assumptions got embedded into structures, and nobody examined the assumptions because everyone in the room shared them. And shared assumptions are invisible. They're just the air. He thought about the rooms, about the seat 2AAs in all the rooms, about all the times the assessment had been made before the boarding pass was checked, about the $62 million contract, about whether, if the contract didn't exist, he would have sent the video. He sat with that question longer than he'd sat with most things in recent memory. It was not a comfortable question. He was starting to understand exactly the right one. He turned. Dr. Carter. She looked at him. I owe you an apology, he said. I started recording because I thought it would make good content. I made the same assessment everyone else made, and I put a camera on it. He looked at his phone. I've sent the footage to my company's compliance team. I'm going to have a difficult conversation with my CEO tonight. He looked at her directly. If you need the footage, for anything you're building, you're welcome to it. Simone looked at him for a long moment. What made you change? She said. He almost laughed. Not quite. I saw your logo, he said, which I recognize is not the right reason. No, she said, the right reason was available to me before that. I just didn't use it. She nodded. You're using it now, she said. Started from the wrong place. Most people start from the wrong place, she said. What matters is whether they get to the right one before it's too late to matter. She held his gaze. Keep the footage, she said. Don't use it for something that cost you something. He looked at her. What does that mean? You'll know, she said, when you get to it. He looked out the window at the tarmac, at the aircraft moving in the distance. He thought, yes, he thought, I think I already know. He picked up his phone again and started a new email to his CEO. Subject line, something I need to tell you about today, and about us. He started typing. The third document came out quietly. No announcement, no framing. Simone simply reached into her bag and a single white page on the tray table. Linda nearby saw it first. She picked it up. Read it. Her face changed. She handed it to Shaw, who had returned to the edge of the first-class section. He read it, went very still. It was a memo. Internal North Star document, dated 11 months ago. From the Passenger Experience Division, addressed to Senior Operations, it documented a review of crew incident reports from the prior fiscal year. It noted, in careful measured corporate language, an elevated frequency of boarding challenges affecting passengers of certain demographic profiles. It recommended a pilot program for mandatory manifest verification before crew challenges were escalated. Flagged as pending, no action taken. Shaw looked at the page. Where did you get this? He said, quietly. It was included in the materials produced during the independent research I commissioned, Simone said. Your company identified the pattern 11 months ago. Your compliance team was aware of it. The solution was proposed internally. She looked at him steadily. 11 of the 17 incidents in that folder happened after this memo was written. Shaw said nothing, because the memo was real, because Northos had seen this coming, had named it. had proposed the fix, and had filed it under pending and moved on. And in the 11 months since, 11 more people had experienced what the memo had already identified as a problem worth solving. Simone looked at the page in Shaw's hand. "This is why I came," she said. "Not to catch anyone in something they didn't know was happening. To understand whether the system was capable of seeing itself." She looked at the window, at N2241CA. It had seen itself, it just didn't move. She looked back. "What I need North Star to explain," she said, "is not why Brenda Holloway did what she did today. I need North Star to explain that memo to Patricia Okafor." The cabin was very quiet, not the held breath, quiet of before, something older. The quiet of people in a room who have just understood something they cannot ununderstand. Jamie at the galley had stopped moving entirely, had been listening with his whole body since the moment Simone placed the white page on the tray table. Sophia Reyes had filled 2 pages of the notebook she'd produced and was writing without looking down. The way people write when they're afraid of losing the thread. Paul Mercer's email was 4 paragraphs long and getting longer. Ray Tatum stood at the rear of the section and thought about the right choice and the available choice and the distance between them. And Brenda Holloway stood behind the curtain, listening to the shape of 11 months, of 17 reports, of 1 memo that sat in a pending file while the thing it described kept happening. She stood there and listened to all of it and did not move. Because sometimes the first real thing you can do is stay still and let the full weight of what you've been part of actually land on you. Without deflecting it, without explaining it away, just letting it land. Simone Carter sat in seat 2A and watched the cabin hold the weight of what it had just learned. Outside, the tarmac shimmered. N2241CA waited. The departure slot was 43 minutes gone, and the second part of what she'd come here to find out was still ahead of her. Not whether North Star could be confronted with what it was doing. She'd answered that. What came next was harder. What came next was whether they could choose to be different. That was the part she couldn't prepare for completely. That was the part that required her to wait and watch and see what people did when they finally understood what they were looking at. The plane was still on the ground. 43 minutes past scheduled departure. Outside, the Houston's tarmac shimmered in the afternoon heat, the kind of heat that made everything at a distance look like it was dissolving at the edges. Ground crew vehicles moved in the distance, small and purposeful, indifferent to what was happening inside aircraft N2241CA. Simone Carter was looking at it, not thinking about it, just using it as somewhere for her eyes to rest while her mind worked on something else. She was thinking about her mother, specifically about a Thursday afternoon in Decatur, Georgia, when she was 9 years old. No particular significance to the day. She'd come home from school, still carrying something a teacher had said, something dismissive, something that had made her feel small of the whole class, and she'd walk through the front door still hot with it, still unable to put it down. Her mother had been at the stove, hadn't turned around, had said, "Baby, the people who try to make you small are always surprised when you turn out to be large." 9 years old. She hadn't fully understood it then. She understood it now with the specific clarity available only to a woman who had spent 43 minutes in this cabin, not raising her voice once, moving methodically through every layer of what needed to be moved through, and was still not finished. Still not finished. Because the confrontation was the easy part. The documents, the contract language, the calls, those were mechanisms, tools she had spent 22 years with building and sharpening and knowing exactly when to use. The hard part was what came after the mechanisms. The hard part was deciding what it was all for. She picked up her phone, opened the recording app, still running, 1 minutes and 42 seconds of everything. Brenda's voice, Shaw's voice, Ray's quietness, Linda's questions, Paul Mercer's recalibration, Sophia's "I saw her boarding pass," the calls with Whitmore, the memo, all of it compressed into a blue line moving across a white screen. She stopped the recording, saved it, labeled it NS2241. Houston, Evidence and Record opened a new file, labeled it NS2241. What happens next? Left it blank, closed the phone, and looked toward the back of the first-class section, where Ray Tatum had been sketching for the last 40 minutes, with the quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to act on it. She could see it in him. She'd been able to see it for a while. She waited. He came to her between the end of the Whitmore call and the departure clearance. The cab settled into something different by then, not the held breath quality of before, something more like aftermath, the particular atmosphere of a room where something significant has occurred, and everyone is still privately processing their own version of what they witnessed. Shaw had gone back to the galley. Linda was in the cockpit working the departure sequence. Paul Mercer had his phone out and was typing steadily, not content, something else. Sophia was writing in a notebook she'd produced from her carry-on, writing quickly, the way people write when they're afraid of losing the thread. And Brenda Holloway was somewhere behind the curtain. Simone could feel her there, the presence of someone waiting to find out what shape their life took now. Ray walked up the aisle, stopped at row 2. He had the face of a man who had made a decision that cost something to make. Not devastating. Not the face of someone broken by it. The specific weight of a person who had chosen honesty over comfort and was standing in that choice without entirely knowing what to do with his hands. Dr. Carter, he said. Officer Tatum, she said, a pause. I want to apologize, he said, for my role in what happened today. She nodded once and waited, because she'd learned, over many years in many rooms, that accepting an apology too quickly let people off the hook of the honest part. The apology was a door. What mattered was what came through it. He understood that. She could see him. I knew who you were, he said, or I thought I did. My younger sister, Cynthia, has worked in your finance department for 5 years. She talks about her job. He looked briefly at his hands, looked back up. She's talked about you, about how you started, about what the company is. He paused. I recognized you in the first 30 seconds. Simone held his gaze, and I said nothing, he said. Why? She said. Not a challenge.
An accusation. A genuine question.
The same question Linda Park had asked at the cockpit door, made personal. Asked by a woman who already understood most of the answer, but knew that some answers needed to be said out loud by the person who had lived them. Ray was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was carefully, with the precision of someone who had been composing this for the last 40 minutes and needed it to come out true rather than just coherent. Because I'm a black man in a uniform, he said. And in my job, that means I don't get to have a personal read on a situation. Or at least that's how it works in practice. If I say I know who she is, I have to explain how I know, and then I'm disclosing a personal connection. And then there's a conflict of interest review. And then I'm pulled from the situation. And then there's an investigation into whether I've been operating with compromised judgment. He paused. I've seen that happen to people. For less. Is that all of it? He looked at her directly. No, he said. What's the rest? The rest is that I was afraid, he said, of being the one who complicated the situation, of saying, wait, something is wrong here, and being wrong, or being right and paying for being right. He paused. And I dressed that fear in professional language and called it process. And I've been doing that for 11 years. He held her gaze. Today it cost you something, he said. Simone sat with that. Outside, a ground vehicle moved across the tarmac, small, orange, going somewhere with purpose. It did, she said. I'm sorry, he said. Not managed, not performed, just true. She looked at him for a long moment. Ray, she said, his first name. Deliberate, leveling the space between them. You are not the problem I came here to solve. He held very still. You are a person who got placed inside a system that doesn't have room for you to do the right thing without paying for it, and you made the calculation that the payment was too high. I understand his calculation. She paused. And it was still wrong. I know, he said. The system needs to change, she said. That's on North Star and on every carrier that builds these structures. But systems change faster when the people inside them start saying wait, even when it costs something. Especially then. She looked at him steadily. Can you do said? Not asking as the woman you left you sitting in a seat while you chose the cheaper option and asking him. Asking as someone who might be in a position to make it less expensive for you to do the right thing if we structure things correctly. He looked at her. What does that mean? He said. It means, she said, that one of my requests to Director Whitmore includes a protected reporting mechanism for crew and security personnel who identify and flag potential bias incidents, a formal channel, with whistleblower protections built in. So that the next time you're standing in an aisle and something doesn't add up, there's a pathway for saying so that doesn't require you to fall on a sword. He stared at her. She had not mentioned this in either of the Whitmore calls. She had been carrying it the whole time. You added that, he said. While you were talking, she said, because of what you told me. She met his eyes. That's how policy gets built. Someone tells the truth about what the system actually costs them. Someone listens. The structure changes to make room for the truth. She paused. It doesn't always work that way, but it can, and today it did. Ray Tatum looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Cynthia, about the Sunday dinner, where he was going to have to describe this. Every part of it, including the parts that didn't reflect well on him. Cynthia was not a person who accepted edited versions of important stories. My sister is going to have a great deal to say about this, he said. I imagine she will, Simone said. And something in the way she said it, the slight warmth of it, the acknowledgement of the particular kind of love that lives in someone who holds you to account because they know what you're capable of, made Ray almost smile. Almost smile. Which for Ray Tatum in this moment was significant. Don't thank me, Simone said. Go be the person who tells this story, in your department. To the officers you train. To the next person standing in aisles when the system is pointing in one direction and their judgment is pointing in another. She paused. Tell the whole story, including the part where you made the wrong choice. That part is the useful part. The cleaned-up version where you figured it out immediately helps nobody. He nodded. Once. Slow. Okay, he said, and walked back to his post. Watch him go. Thought, that man is going to do something with today. Thought, that matters. Thought, that might matter more than the contract in the long run, though I'm not ready to say that out loud. Brenda Holloway came out from behind the curtain at minute 51. Nobody sent for her. Nobody told her to. She simply appeared at the galley entrance and then walked slowly down the aisle and stopped at seat 2A. Stood there. Simone looked up. Brenda Holloway was 39 years old and 11 years into a career and had the face of someone who had been standing behind a curtain for the last 50 minutes listening to The Shape of a Very Bad Day become completely clear. She looked like someone who wasn't entirely sure what they were doing standing here but had decided to do it anyway, which was something. I don't, she started, stopped. Simone waited. I want to say I'm sorry, Brenda said finally, but I'm aware that doesn't, another stop. She looked at the floor, at her shoes. At the first-class carpet walked the length of 50, 60, 70 times. I am aware that sorry isn't enough. It's a start, Simone said. Brenda looked up. Simone was looking at her steadily, not warmly, not coldly. The way you look at something you are trying to understand clearly, without the distortion, either sympathy or judgment pulling the picture. I want to ask you something, Simone said. Brenda waited. When you came to my seat, what did you see? A long, quiet. A woman, Brenda said, in first class.
And what did
That look like to you?
longer quiet?
The kind that has an answer inside it that the person has never said out loud. It looked, Brenda's voice was very low. It looked wrong. Why? No answer. I'm not asking to humiliate you, Simone said. I'm asking because you cannot fix a thing you haven't named. And the remediation process you're about to go through will be useless if you go into it without naming it. Brenda looked at her and said, with the specific difficulty of something saying some true that has never been said before, not to anyone, not even in the privacy of their own interior, because it didn't match what I expected to see. And what did you expect to see? Silence. Not me, Simone quietly, not an accusation. A fact placed carefully in the space between them. Brenda's jaw tightened. No, she said, and that expectation, Simone said. Where do you think it came from? Brenda had no answer ready. Simone didn't push. Some questions don't need to be answered in the moment. Some questions need to be carried home, turned over, sat with in a parked car in a driveway on a Thursday evening. Some questions start working on a person long after the conversation that introduced them. You have a remediation process ahead of you, Simone said. I've asked Director Whitmore not to terminate you today. That decision has conditions. What you do with the conditions is up to you. Brenda looked at her. Why, she said. Why not just? Because firing you makes North Star feel like the problem is handled, Simone said. The problem is not handled by removing one person. The problem is the 11 years in which this behavior met no consequence and therefore continued. Termination right now doesn't touch that. It just moves the symptom. She paused. I want you to go through a process that requires you to actually look at what you did and why you did it. That's harder than being fired, and it's the only thing that might actually change something. Brenda stood with that, looking at the woman in seat 2A, who had not raised her voice once. who had not cried, had not threatened, had not performed her injury for the cabin's benefit, who had simply been here, steadily here. With her documents and her watch and her patience and the absolute certainty of someone who had built something the room hadn't yet understood, Brenda thought, I don't know what to do with a person like this. She thought, maybe that's the point. Okay, she said, very quietly, turned, walked back to the galley. The third call with Whitmore was the one that mattered most. The previous two had been necessary, positioning, establishing facts and leverage and the clear terms of who held what. This call was different. This was the one where Simone made the offer. Linda facilitated from the cockpit, but this time Simone held the handset herself. Director Whitmore, she said, I want to revise the scope of what we discussed. A pause. Revise how? Upward, she said. A longer pause. She could feel him recalibrating. The direction he'd been preparing for was further concession, further damage control. The direction she was moving was the one he hadn't prepared for. The current contract value is $340 million over 5 years, she said. 23 aircraft. Yes, I'm prepared to extend to $480 million over 7 years. 31 aircraft, including 4 long-haul models that Northstar has been on the wait list for. She let that number exist in the air between them, in exchange for 4 things, not 3. He waited. The first 3 remain as stated, independent review of all 17 incidents. Mandatory verification protocol within 30 days. Structured remediation for Brenda Holloway. She paused. The 4th is new. I'm listening, he said, and this time she believed it. Every Northstar contract with an aircraft lessor, going forward, must include a measurable diversity and equity compliance clause. Quarterly reporting to an independent oversight body, Pacific metrics, not aspirational language. Numbers. That's something I can agree to on this call, he said. Assets, I know, she said. I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you it's the 4th thing. You have 72 hours, because this one requires your board. Dr. Carter, what you're describing would effectively set a standard that doesn't currently exist in our industry. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it would do. Other lessors may not. Other lessors will follow when the largest contracts in the market start requiring it, she said. That's how standards get set, not by committees, by the terms of important agreements. She paused. I have the leverage. I'm making it a condition. And I'm also making it an opportunity. Northstar can be the carrier that led this, or the carrier that was required to follow. Those are different positions. Silence. The carrot and the contract. Together. And if we can't get board approval in 72 hours, he said, then we proceed with the original 3 conditions and the original contract value, and I take the long-haul aircraft offer to Delta. She said it without edge. It didn't need edge. It was a fact. He knew it was a fact. 72 hours, he said. 72 hours, she confirmed, and Dr. Carter, she waited. I want to. He stopped. She could hear him working at something. The sound of a man who had spent decades in corporate language and was now trying to get to the other side of it. I want to say that I'm sorry. Not because I'm supposed to. I'm saying it because I was in a room with you 14 months ago and I knew you had this flight and I didn't think about what that meant for the people on the plane who wouldn't know your name. It didn't occur to me to think about it. That, she said, is the thing to fix. Everything downstream of this situation is downstream of that. She ended the call, placed the handset down, sat with the quiet. The auxiliary power hummed its low, steady note. The window, N2241CA, waited, and somewhere in the counting of the last hour and 16 minutes, a number had shifted from 340 million to 480 million. Not as reward, as mechanism. Money was always a mechanism. The goal was the clause that would travel from this contract into the next contract, and the next, the way good policy traveled, when someone with enough leverage decided to make it move. She thought about Patricia Okafor. $250, she thought. This is what I can do with your story. She thought. I hope it's enough, she thought. It won't be everything, but it's a start, and starts are what you build from. Sophia Reyes had filled 4 pages of her notebook. She hadn't planned to write. She'd produced the notebook because she always had one, and because thinking moved faster when her hand was moving. And then she'd started and couldn't stop. She was writing about Chicago to Denver. About the man in business class and the slow erosion of the things she'd watched and said nothing about and driven home carrying and had been carrying since. She was writing about what she'd seen in this cabin today, about the difference between the two situations. The mechanisms had been identical. The assessment made before checking. The weight of the moment pushing in one direction. The quiet distributed assumption that the person being questioned was probably in the wrong. Same thing, different outcome. Because of who the woman in seat 2A was. And that, Sophia wrote, is the problem with relying on individual power to solve structural failure. Because Patricia Okafor doesn't have a $340 million contract, and the next person in seat 2A after Dr. Carter might be Patricia Okafor. And what protects Patricia Okafor when there's no leverage in her bag? She stopped writing, looked at what was on the page, thought, this is an article. This is something people outside this industry need to read. She worked in aviation insurance. She wrote industry pieces occasionally, careful ones, technical ones. How the kind shared on LinkedIn by people who skimmed the headline and counted the like as engagement. This was not that kind of piece. She looked at the woman in seat 2A, who was looking at the window with the posture of someone who had done what they came to do and was allowing themselves to simply exist in the moment rather than manage it. Dr. Carter, Sophia said. I'm sorry to bother you. You're not, Simone said. Sophia held up the notebook. I've been writing about today, and about something that happened to me 14 months ago that I've been thinking about ever since. She paused. I write industry pieces, aviation insurance. I'd like to write about today, about what I saw happen and what happened after, about the difference between individual power and structural change. With your permission. Simone looked at her. Not about you specifically, Sophia said. About the system. About the question of what protects the person who doesn't have a contract in their bag. Simone was quiet for a moment. One of the 17 people in that report is a woman named Patricia Okafor, she said. She's consented to her incident being documented. Whether she'd consent to a public piece, you'd need to find her and ask. Of course, Sophia said. But the question you described, Simone said. What protects the person without leverage? Write that. Put it somewhere that reaches people who fly. Not just people who work in aviation. Sophia looked at her. I've never written for a general audience, she said. You've been watching this cabin for over an hour, Simone said. You have a general audience's eye. The people on this plane are the general audience. Use what you saw. Sophia looked down at her notebook, looked up. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Simone said. Write it first, then see if it was worth thanking anyone for. And something in the way she said it, dry and direct and without performance, made Sophia almost laugh. She turned back to her notebook and kept writing. Paul Mercer had not gone back to his presentation. He'd been conducting the internal audit for 30 minutes now, and it wasn't going particularly well, which meant it was going the way honest audits go. He was on the board of 3 companies. He moved through rooms where decisions got made and assumptions got built into structures, and nobody examined the assumptions, because everyone in the room shared them, and shared assumptions were invisible. They were just the air. The thing you breathed without noticing you were breathing. He thought about those rooms, about every seat 2A that existed in them, about the assessments made before any boarding pass was checked, about the video on his phone, which was accurate, which showed exactly what had happened, which he had sent to his compliance team for reasons that started wrong and ended somewhere different. About the $62 million contract. He thought about whether, if the contract didn't exist, he would have sent it. He sat with that question. It was not comfortable. He was beginning to understand the right question to be sitting with. The one that required him to see himself without the benefit of the better story he usually told. He turned. Dr. Carter. She looked at him. I want to be useful, he said. Not just sorry, tell me what useful looks like. She looked at him for a moment. Your company insures aviation fleets, she said. Yes. Do your contracts include any provisions around carrier compliance with passenger equity standards? He thought. Safety protocols, operational compliance, nothing around how passengers are treated. She nodded. That's a gap, she said. In the same way the North Star lease agreement had a gap before we put language in 6 years ago. An insurance company that included equity compliance in its underwriting criteria would have a different kind of leisure than a lesser. Different reach. Different client relationships. He stared at her. She looked back steadily. I'm not telling you what to do with your company, she said. You asked what useful looks like from where I'm sitting. The gap in your contracts is visible. He sat with that. That's a significant revision to underwriting criteria, he said. Yes, she said. It would take a long time. These take a long time, she said. They take longer if nobody starts. He looked at the seat back in front of him, thought about the rooms, thought about the gaps, thought about what it would mean to walk into the next room and say, I've been looking at something I think we need to change. Here's what I saw. Here's what it cost someone. Thought about that, what would cost him. Thought about what it cost other people when he didn't. He picked up his phone, opened the email he'd been writing to his CEO. Added 3 more paragraphs, the ones he'd been avoiding, the ones about the gap. The departure clearance came at minute 81. Captain Linda Park's voice came through the intercom. Professional, steady, the voice of 24 years of doing this with precision and care. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Park. I apologize for our delay today. We're now cleared for departure and anticipate arriving in Atlanta close to schedule despite our late start. Flight time is approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes. She paused, which a standard part of a departure announcement. Captains don't pause. Pauses cost fuel and time, and ground operations notice them. This one paused anyway. I also want to say something that isn't a standard part of what I usually say up here. The cabin was absolutely still. Something happened on the flight today that shouldn't have. A passenger was treated in a way that doesn't reflect the standards of this profession or basic human decency. That's been acknowledged and is being addressed. I'm telling you this not because I'm required to, but because I believe that when something goes wrong in a shared space, the people who share that space deserve to know that it's been seen clearly. Another pause. We're going to take care of you on this flight. That's my commitment. Thank you for your patience. The intercom clicked off. 3 seconds of complete silence, and then Sophia Reyes Diaz started clapping, softly at first. The claps of someone who isn't certain the room will follow and is doing it anyway. Because it's right, because something deserves acknowledgement, even if you're the only one offering it. Then the man in 4cc, then the woman across from him, then Paul Mercer, who looked faintly surprised at his own hands. Then at the back of the first-class section, Ray Tatum, who brought his palms together slowly, deliberately, with the dignity of someone who understood exactly what was being recognized. Not a victory, not a resolution. The acknowledgement that something had gone wrong and had been seen clearly. That was what deserved the applause, the seeing. Simone did not clap. She pressed her forehead against the window. Just for a second. Just for one private moment with the glass cool against her skin and the cabin noise around her and nobody watching and no leverage and no recording and no contract. Just a woman on a plane, tired, honestly, profoundly tired, not defeated, not broken, not diminished in any way that would be visible to anyone who looked at her in this moment or any other. Just tired with the specific of a woman who has had to be twice as prepared to be treated half as fairly and has been doing that mathematics for 22 years. And some cost more than others. Today, it had cost more than usual, not because of Brenda Holloway specifically. Because today, like every day this happened, was not the first time, was not even close to the first time, was in fact one of so many times that she had stopped being surprised by any individual instance and had spent 4 months commissioned research and 3 weeks planning a flight and 1 hour and 21 minutes, sitting still in seat 2A with a watch running and a folder in her bag, and the patience of a woman who had learned that the only way to change a system was to be more prepared than the system expected. That was the exhaustion, not the anger. The weight of always having to be ready. She lifted her head from the window, straightened, opened her laptop, opened the blank file, NS2241. What happens next? And started writing Atlanta. The wheels touched down at 4:47 p.m., 31 minutes behind schedule. But there, a gate agent met her at the jet bridge with a printed note from Whitmore's office, confirming receipt of the 3 conditions, promising formal response within 48 hours on the 4th. She took the note, folded it once, put it in her breast pocket alongside the boarding pass that had been placed on a tray table instead of returned to her hand. She kept them both. Not as trophies, as records. She walked through Hartsfield-Jackson in the late afternoon. The particular energy of an airport that has been moving people all day and is running on the momentum of its own machinery. Thousands of people going somewhere, all carrying the particular weight of being in between. She found a seat near the window, called Denise. I'm on the ground. 31 minutes late, Denise said. How was it? Simone looked out at the runway, at a Northwest aircraft taxiing in the distance, at the tail number she couldn't read from here. Exactly what I expected, she said. And worse. And better. That's not an answer. No, she agreed. It's not. A pause. Are you okay, Denise said. Simone thought about the window, the cool glass, the 1 private second with her forehead against it while the cabin held its breath. I will be, she said, which was true. And different from yes. And Denise, who had known her for 14 years, heard the difference without needing it explained. The board meeting is at 7, Denise said. I know. Car? Yes, she said. Actually, yes, she hung up, sat for another minute, watching the planes. Her planes, some of them. Planes full of people going somewhere. People who deserve to get there without being handed their boarding passes back off tray tables. People who would never have a $480 million contract as leverage. People who needed the system to change because they couldn't change it themselves. That was the whole point. Had always been the whole point. She stood up, picked up her bag, walked out in the Atlanta evening. 9 months later, Ray Tatum stood at the front of a training room at Houston Intercontinental. 22 security officers. Mixed experience. The mild, institutional skepticism of people who had sat through many trainings and developed appropriate defenses. He looked at them. I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me 9 months ago, he said. I'm going to tell you the whole story, including the part where I made the wrong choice, because that part is the part that matters. He told them about NS2241, about recognizing the woman in seat 2A, about the 4 seconds of calculation, about choosing the available option over the right one, dressing that choice in professional language and calling it process. He told them about the protected reporting mechanism that now existed in their department. The formal channel, the whistleblower protections, the thing that hadn't existed 9 months ago and existed now because a woman in a dark blazer had listened to him tell his truth and built a structure around it. The next time something in a boarding situation doesn't add up, he said, there is now a way to say so without falling on a sword. He looked at the room. Not for her, not for me. Because the person in the seat says a system that doesn't require them to own 300 aircraft before someone asks the right question. He looked at 22 people who would walk out of this room and back into the machinery of an airport. Any questions? A hand went up. What happened to the flight attendant? Brenda Holloway, Ray said. She completed the remediation program. She's still working, Kiki. She gave a statement to the independent review board about her own history of unchallenged assumptions. He paused. She's not the villain of this story. She's what a system produces when it never requires you to look at yourself. She's looking now. He looked at the room. Go do your jobs, he said. Do them like someone's watching, because someone usually is, and sometimes, he paused. Sometimes they own the plane. Sophia Reyes published the article 4 months after NS2241. Not on an aviation industry publication, in a national magazine with 4 million readers. The headline was simple. What protects the passenger without power? She wrote about Chicago to Denver, about her own silence and the weight she'd carried home from it. She wrote about NS2241 and what she'd witnessed and what had changed, and what the difference was between individual power and structural protection, and why that difference mattered in the gap between them every single day. She wrote about Patricia Okafor, who had consented to be named, and Anne had said when Sophia found her. I want people to know it happened. I want it to have meant something beyond a voucher. The article for 400,000 in shares in the first week. It was read into the congressional record during a transportation equity hearing. It was taught in 2 business school courses on organizational ethics. Sophia didn't stop writing technical insurance pieces. But she didn't stop writing the other kind either, because she'd learned, in seat 3B on a delayed flight to Atlanta, that the general audience she'd never written for was made up of people who flew, who sat in cabins, who watched things happen, who were still deciding every time whether they were the kind of person who said something. Paul Mercer had the conversation with his CEO. It lasted 2.5 hours. It was not comfortable. The CEO asked several questions Paul didn't have good answers to. At one point, the CEO said, "Why didn't you intervene earlier?" And Paul said, "Because I was thinking about contract and not about what I was actually poaching." And the CEO took quiet for a long time. 3 months later, the company began revising its underwriting criteria. It took 14 months. It required 7 internal working groups and 2 outside consultants and 1 board presentation where Paul stood up and told the story of NS-2T241 from seat C, including the 47 seconds of footage he'd started for the wrong reasons and finished for better ones. The new criteria were not perfect. They were a start. Starts are what you build from. Brenda Holloway finished the remediation program on a Thursday afternoon, drove home, sat in her car in the driveway for 20 minutes. She was thinking about something the facilitator had said in the final session, of whom had spent 15 years working on organizational bias, and who had the quality of someone who'd seen a great deal and remained curious about all of it. The sentence was, "The question isn't whether you have biases. You do. Everyone does. The question is whether you've looked at them, because the ones you haven't looked at run your decisions without your permission." Brenda sat with that in her driveway. She thought about 11 years, about the assumptions she'd acted on so many times that she'd stopped experiencing them as choices. They had become instinct. They had become doing her job. She thought of seat 2A, about the boarding pass placed on the tray table instead of returned to the hand, about the woman who had picked it up without comment and waited for the room to understand what it was looking at. She thought, "I wasn't looking at myself," she thought. "I have to look now." She went inside. She was still a flight attendant. She was trying to be a different one, which was, the facilitator had told her, the most honest thing any of them could say. Trying to be. Simone Carter's board meeting ended at 10. She drove home alone. The Atlanta night was the deep blue of a southern summer evening, and the highway was open the way it sometimes was at that hour, and she drove with the windows slightly down and something slow on the radio. She thought about the contract, $480 million, 7 years, the equity clause. She thought about what Patricia Okafor had said when Sophia found her. "I want it to have meant something," she thought. It meant something. It's meaning something. It will keep meaning something as long as there are people in those as aisles who ask the question before the machinery moves. She thought about Linda Park. 1 question. 30 seconds. The entire cover. Has anyone verified this through the system? No, she thought, that's what I want. More people asking that question. In 30 seconds, before the assessment hardens into action, she pulled into her driveway, sat for a moment in the quiet. The house was dark. The neighborhood was still. The Atlanta night was doing what Atlanta nights do, which is be warm and large and slightly beyond what any one person can contain. She reached into her breast pocket, took out the boarding pass, held it for a moment. Seat 2X, first class, North Star NS-2E241, Houston to Atlanta. The slight crease where Brenda had held it, the faint displacement from where it had been set down on the tray table instead of returned to the hand that had offered it. Small things, the kind of small things that add up. She held it for one more moment, then put it back, got out of the car. The sky above Atlanta was dark and clear. She didn't look up. She went inside. She had 7 o'clock in the morning. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. That was the thing about systems. You didn't fix them once. You kept fixing them. One question, one clause, one conversation, one person deciding to look at themselves day after day until it held.